and I got it. So I managed to mute the YouTube. So hello everybody, we're here again for part 2 with Brandon. And we also have Cliff Stamp and Joe. And so I thought we would just go ahead and get started since it's late at night. And I kind of want to get started again with Brandon, sort of recap a little bit. What is intelligent design theory to you? And especially, how is it being misrepresented sort of in the typical Google Plus Hangout or YouTube video?
Hey, well, thanks, Helena, for setting this up despite Google's propensity to ruin good things. But intelligent design, what we talked about last time was it's the idea that certain features of the natural world are best explained by an intelligent cause. So you've got like digital code in DNA, molecular machinery that's irreducibly complex, and things like that. What we talked about last time was we kind of talked about several things that intelligent design isn't, and these are common ways that I feel like intelligent design is mischaracterized or strawmanned. And one of the most common things is that the idea that intelligent design is an appeal to the supernatural, and we discussed that. We discussed terminology, and then we also discussed whether intelligent design is a God of the gaps argument. And I believe I made the point that even if you disagree with the conclusions of intelligent design, it's just not structured like a God of the gaps argument. And from there we went into how is the argument structured, and we talked a little bit about uniformitarianism and explaining effects by reference to their known causes. And I think that pretty much summarizes most of the conversation that we had.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And I know that I was hung up a little bit on intelligent, like what's intelligent about it. We talked about that.
Right.
Some of the interesting things that you just said is that I think most people think that if they hear intelligent design or ID, they immediately think it must involve the supernatural. And you're claiming no, not at all. So
Right.
I think maybe you could talk a little bit about that, and then we'll get into sort of the specifics, two of which you mentioned in your description at the very beginning of this hangout.
Yeah. So I really think that either way, whether you're arguing for the supernatural or not, you can defend intelligent design. One of the interesting points we talked about last time was these studies about the effects of prayer, and most skeptics get real excited about that because of the results. They seem to suggest that, if anything, there's a deleterious effect of prayer on people who are sick. But the interesting concession there is that science was studying the supernatural. It was an open possibility that science could have ascertained the existence of supernatural effects. So I think it's kind of arbitrary to say that science can't study the supernatural. It seems to me if the supernatural has any effects, then there's no reason in principle why we can't trace back the causal chain there. But then the other thing is that intelligent design doesn't necessarily argue for the supernatural. It doesn't take a position on the nature of the designer. So, and then that, of course, gets down to how do you define these words like supernatural. And we had an interesting discussion last time about maybe the proper contrary to natural isn't supernatural. Maybe it's intelligence. And we went over some of the ways that we actually use these words, like anytime that we make a real distinction between natural and something else, it has to do with whether or not a mind was involved. Like, was somebody murdered, or did they die of natural causes? Or does this pattern on the rocks, is this a naturally occurring thing, or is it man-made? So in each case, the distinguishing fact is when something is the product of a mind. So I think, in my mind, that is a good distinction. And supernatural, to me, is much more problematic because we tend to think of something as supernatural up until the point that we understand it or we're able to control it. And so therefore, to me, the way that we use the word supernatural, it's not actually describing the thing itself that's in question. It's just a statement about our state of knowledge, and it changes based on how our knowledge changes. So I think if you're going to say what is the proper contrary to the word natural, to me the clear answer is intelligent cause is the proper contrary there. So I think there are a number of different angles you can look at this from.
So you're saying that the opposite of natural is intelligent.
Yeah, I think that's how we use the language.
That's really interesting. Well, I definitely agree. I mean, this is this is something that's bothered me constantly about, naturalism is this argument that you bring up, and so, and to me, it's legit, right? If we're going to just say that supernatural is the stuff we can't study, or the stuff that doesn't seem to exist because it's hard to study, or any kind of weird thing like that, then anytime we start to understand some phenomenon, then we pull it away from supernatural or non-natural and just sort of put it in the category of natural because we've understood it.
Yeah.
Yeah. But you originally said that intelligent design can also include the natural. Am I correct?
Well, yeah, I mean, basically. The point is that intelligent design doesn't take a position on the nature of the designer, whether it's natural or supernatural. I personally don't think that's a real distinction. Other people, they think it is a real distinction. They just simply say, well, intelligent design doesn't take a position. Now,
So what's key for you is this mind.
yeah.
Would you agree with that?
Right. The entire point of intelligent design is the entire question of intelligent design is whether we can discern the effects of an intelligent cause. Or some people get caught up on the word intelligent. You could say, you could appeal to mind or consciousness. Whether we can discern the effects of a mind or conscious activity.
So someone, real quick, Joe, someone in the side chat just sort of mentioned how could ID, for example, not require a supernatural designer? Well, the example that's in my head, and I'm keeping it there, I'm holding it there in my head as we talk, is, the idea of, I don't know, alien life forms, right? Panspermia kind of thing. But a kind of a sci-fi panspermia where it was on purpose. It wasn't just that, life, sort of accidentally hit the Earth, but that there were aliens. So, super aliens from some super other planet, still nonetheless natural, could have seeded life on this planet, and that would fall, at least as far as you are concerned, and correct me if I'm wrong, that would count as an intelligent design example. Am I right or not?
Yes, definitely. Now, I think it's important to clarify that sometimes people can get caught up with, well, if you're just positing aliens that are very similar to us, well, you haven't explained anything because you have to then explain those aliens which have all the same qualities as we do. But this is actually something that's resolved outside of the purview of intelligent design. So some people might have.
Sorry, go ahead.
So just the question of, okay, are we stuck now with an infinite regress if you're positing that kind of an intelligent cause? Now you're outside of the purview. Now you're exploring, okay, the nature of this designer. So you can still posit. It doesn't take away from the original inference. So you can still posit from intelligence design a natural designer. even if for other reasons you think that that's not really the best conclusion. So even if you think it's a bad conclusion there, you still can't say that intelligent design has to posit a supernatural designer.
Right, and you want to
In my
say
opinion.
that once we get to the point where we're talking about the nature of this designer, then we're already out of ID.
Yeah,
We're not involving the theory at all. It's kind of like the Kalam, right? You get to the third premise. That's the end of it. After that,
right.
you have to do more work to get to
Hmm.
whatever God you may want to get to. And you're saying that
Yeah.
this is also the truth, the fact with respect to intelligent design theory.
Yeah. Uh,
Do you think that your view is a mainstream view, or do you think that it's uh, an odd or not mainstream?
well, I mean, I'm more concerned about whether it's the best inference, whether it makes the most sense, and I think it does. I think there is a strong movement that things look designed because they actually are designed. We have actually seen a number of people come onto the intelligent design side. I mean, in 2004, you had Anthony Flew, who was a huge name in atheism and in philosophy. And by the end of his life, he explicitly came over to the design side. He said that the design arguments are what persuaded him to um, not recant. That's probably too strong a word, but to give up atheism for deism because of design arguments. And I think there are other notable figures, significant figures. Now, Thomas Nagel, he's a philosopher of science who has now put out a book about how materialism is almost certainly wrong. Now, that's very close to coming to a design position, although he doesn't. He's not a design proponent. He doesn't take a position on what the alternative to materialism might be.
Well,
But I think there's definitely an influence. You could definitely see an influence.
Okay, so we'll hear from Joe, and then we'll get into the specifics finally. So, Joe, it sounded like you've got a couple things you want to say.
yeah, I have a few things. There's a process at which I think that intelligent design can be it can be decided whether or not it's a good explanation, and I can get into that if anyone's interested. But I think that it kind of agrees with a lot of the parameters that Brandon sets up. Like I think that it is the case that we should be looking for the best explanation of something, not deciding, well, if it's supernatural, then we can't use it as an explanation. If it's the case that fairies explain fairy rings, the rings of mushrooms around things, if that's the case, then okay, that's cool. Fairies exist. Now what do we do with this concept of fairies? Like I don't have a problem with in principle using explanations that do appeal to supernatural phenomenon. I Again, it's the best explanation should be decided upon. The issue that kind of happens with intelligent design that I'm sorry, the issue, and this is where intelligent design is kind of lumped in, is that so many of our explanations that are successful, some the best explanations that we have, do appeal to known phenomenon. They appeal to natural phenomenon, and it's not necessarily that. There certainly are people who take a purely materialistic stance. There certainly are people who think that science shouldn't even bother with God or shouldn't even bother with the supernatural. But I don't think that that's the best way to go about it. However, even if we do go about it the way that I think we should, which is deciding between competing explanations and picking the best explanation, it still is the case that intelligent design fails.
Well, that sounds like the perfect segue. So let's start looking at the different phenomenon and what the best explanation could be. And I'm going to let Brandon go first.
Well, I mean, for me, the most convincing piece of evidence is the digital code in DNA. But then there are also the molecular machinery in in the cells that are irreducibly complex, and I think these are pretty well defined features, and you can tell from our experience whether we have an alternative cause to intelligence. And the fact of the matter is that, well, that's still a question under investigation. We're still investigating whether material causes can produce these things which are known to be produced by mind. And since it's still an open question, it hasn't been resolved, and so therefore there's no current alternative. So that's my position. I don't think that there has been an alternative explanation posited so far from the materialist side. The latest information I'm aware of is there was a paper, I think last year or the year before, that came out about that tried to tackle the sequencing problem in DNA. So how can we get this kind of a code from the laws of chemistry and physics? And the researchers had some interesting results, but ultimately they said that the system they were positing would have required a prior code. So, and that's the latest information that I'm aware of on the subject. And
so before we go into DNA, let's talk about the irreducibly complex first, because I've got a couple of problems with that. First of all, assuming that these organelles, I think you're talking about, right? The organelles in the cell, or
there are various features that are said to be irreducibly complex, and the famous example is the flagellar motor.
Okay, so let's talk about that. Let's assume that it is irreducibly complex. How does that lend support to the idea that that mind is involved? And also, why does, whether it's reducible or irreducible, how does that have anything to do with whether mind was involved or not involved? So tease that out for me.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I mean, I keep coming back to the fact that these are well-defined structures with well-defined features. And so it's a simple question of whether it's a simple question of the range of explanatory resources that are available to us. So it's very easy to recognize that minds do produce machines that are irreducibly complex, where you remove any one part and you lose the function. Now, it's an open question as to whether nature can produce the same effect. And this is, yeah, it's. I think it's just that simple. You have well-defined features, and you have a known cause for these kinds of features, and you don't have a materialist cause so far.
So Cliff brought up a point that somebody should define irreducibly complex. Yeah. So I'm going to give that to Cliff.
I think it's also related to the second thing you talked about, the molecular machines, or is it also related to the DNA evidence?
What, irreducible complexity?
Yeah.
That's
well,
a good
define it first. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, I think a rough definition is a system of interacting parts that perform a function wherein the removal of any one part causes a loss of that function. And back in the early 2000s, I want to say 2004, 2005, Scott Minnick did experiments. They were called knockout experiments, where they tested this. There were 30-something parts, I think, in the flagellar motor, and every time they knocked out one of the parts that was said to be part of the irreducibly complex structure, the organism lost motility. So there was the loss of function, just as Behe defined there would be.
Now, in that definition, does it specifically say that when a part is removed that there is no function, or just that the current function is lost?
That's a great question. I think it's the current function.
Yeah.
It doesn't say that there's no function.
Yeah, that's the issue I'm having with it. Is that it assumes that it's kind of like to deal with defining what a vestigial organ is. Oftentimes people think that a vestigial organ is an organ that's worthless or doesn't function, but it's not even, that's not it. It's an organ that's lost its ancestral function. At some point in time, this organ, this vestigial organ, had a specific function. And then over time, over evolution, when we branched out different species, all that kind of stuff, it's in certain branches, certain species, that organ didn't function the same way that it functioned when in the ancestor of all those species. Same with this irreducible complexity argument. It seems like if you do take out a part, it could be the case that it loses its function in the context in which it is, but if you go back in time and you take the same thing, missing the same part, in that context, it could be the case that the organism is actually successful, and then over time it evolved and then it developed into a different function. So,
Right, and you're making the case essentially for the. Oh, I'm getting echo. Somebody echoing.
So if we all
Do I
mute,
still have the echo?
everybody
no more
mute
echo.
except the person speaking, and then after a while we
Yeah.
won't have to do that any longer.
Yeah. Okay. So you're essentially making the case about or for the plausibility of a material cause that, well, there could have been a selectable function in the past. And yeah, that's completely fine. When Behe first articulated his argument, he actually discussed this idea of co-option, it's often called now, where the structure has some other function, and therefore it was able to evolve in a kind of a stepwise function, although maybe not as direct as we normally described evolution. But the important point here is that nobody is saying that nature couldn't have done it. That nobody is saying that, nobody's making an absolute claim about that. It's completely possible that nature is able to produce these things. It's just that we don't know that it can. Intelligent design doesn't accept it as an assumption that nature can produce these features. But it says that we do know currently that mind produces them. That's what we currently know. And we're open to the possibility that nature can produce them as well. It's just that we don't know that yet. That is an open question. I think that's what people forget sometimes, is that it is an open question as to whether or not nature can produce these things. And it's entirely possible that it may turn out to be the case that nature can't do it. And it requires mind.
Just a little bit more on the definitions, because, the more I think about it, you're saying irreducibly complex. Well, what are you really saying there? I mean, that just sounds like you mean to say super simple. And so, again, I'm still struggling with why or how it is that showing that something is irreducibly complex, assuming that it is, implies mind.
I think the difference between like a system that's complex and a system that's irreducibly complex is that a system that's irreducibly complex is complex in one manner, but simple in another manner that doesn't have any superfluous parts. Like, for example, if you look at a bicycle, you could take the seat off and you could still use it exactly as a bicycle. It would have all the functions of a bicycle, except it would be awkward to ride because you would suddenly be like sort of straggling over the top of it. You could take, for example, the pedals off and just replace them with like the little metal, spokes that comes out with no actual paddle there. You could still ride it. It would be very difficult, but you could still ride it. But the argue is, if you reduce the bicycle down to the simplest set of functions that was required for it to be a bicycle. At that point, it's irreducibly complex, because if you take anything off, it no longer works as a bicycle. The function of it, bicycleness, is gone. So that's when something goes from complex to being irreducibly complex.
So
Yeah, so you can think of
where's
it
the
as
complexity? Where's the
structurally.
complexity? That's what I'm wondering about with that bicycle. What
Well,
about
that's an
that? What
important.
about that stripped down bicycle is
That's an important.
complex? It's not
Yeah,
important.
that's an important. No, I'm saying that is an important point, because the argument is not so much about the complexity. We see complex things all the time. Last time I talked about the arrangement of grains of sand on the seashore, and that's complex, but nobody infers design from that. So the point isn't complexity. The point is the type of complexity. And so the part that allows us to infer design is the irreducible complexity. So I think another way to say that is that this structure is structurally parsimonious. That might be a good way to put it, where it has the bare minimum interacting parts to retain function.
Yeah. I don't know if this might go off on a tangent, but do you think that intelligent design is only a valuable explanation or theory when it comes to irreducibly complex organisms or functions or whatever, or is it something that should be expanded to all things that are usually covered by evolution or evolution by natural selection? It sounds to me like you're saying that intelligent design should come in to explain these irreducibly complex organisms. But then earlier you mentioned that intelligent design should be something we can think of, but once it is the case that we infer intelligent design, talking about the nature of that intelligent designer is something outside the field. Like you mentioned earlier, that if it's an alien, we have to step back from the field in order to talk about the alien who's designing these things. So I don't know if it just doesn't seem like it's a good idea to posit intelligent design if it can only, or especially to posit it as a better explanation, if it can only explain a certain thing, like irreducibly complex organisms, and it can only explain them insofar that we could say this is intelligently designed, and we can't say anything about that intelligent designer. We have to go into some other branch, or we have to step back. I mean, where's the value in that? That's my issue.
Well, I mean, the alternative question is, where is the value in an explanation that can explain anything? And intelligent design is constrained. I would say that that's a strength, not a weakness. Karl Popper tried to argue with, I think, a lot of success. A lot of people take his point of view that a scientific idea has to be constrained, and it had to be constrained specifically by being falsifiable. That's a whole other topic. But simply the fact that a scientific idea must be constrained, not unconstrained. Intelligent design is constrained to only the effects of an intelligent cause. So it can't just posit intelligent design, wherever we see something we haven't directly observed the origin of it. It's not one of these ideas that could just explain anything and therefore explains nothing. That's a strength, that it is constrained only to the effects that are known to be produced by an intelligent cause.
But you don't see it as a problem that when we do go, well, it's clear that the best explanation is that this is intelligently designed, but we can't like speak about that intelligent designer.
Well, I think I will grant this. It's important only insofar that we cannot rule out an intelligent cause. Like, if we could rule out intelligent cause, then that would be relevant to whether or not we can infer to an intelligent cause.
Well,
but you have to establish a universal negative, though, so you can't rule out intelligent cause, and that's the only place where I'd say the nature of the designer might be irrelevant.
Sure. I mean, like earlier, I agreed with you. You can't rule out supernatural explanations. Like, again, it's what's the best explanation? If the best explanation is that it is an alien that's designing it, or like I said earlier, it's pixies that are doing, or fairies doing something, we
Yeah, or
should
we're
go
just some kind of computer program.
yeah, or something like that. We should go. I mean, if that's the best explanation, sure. But we were talking about falsification and something being constrained um, as being like good qualities that an explanation has. I actually I'm interested in talking about that. What are good qualities of a powerful explanation? One of them would be considered falsification. I tend to put falsification in the concept of simplicity, but that's another that can be some other topic. Anyways, the issue is that there's a lot of other explanatory virtues, qualities that you can identify in a very good explanation that that evolution has over intelligent design. It is to some extent good that a explanation is constrained, because if it becomes too broad, then it's hard to compare it with our background knowledge, right? Um, for example, if you say that this can explain everything, it explains everything. There's nothing for it to cohere to. Uh, so that's one quality of a good explanation. But there are several other qualities like scope, testability, fecundity, and I've already mentioned simplicity. There's also ontological economy. I'm not ready to explicitly say what that is, but it's an explanatory
Please
virtue.
don't. I will.
Yeah. I could say it. I just have it right in front of me. There's informativeness, past success, and I already mentioned background knowledge. These are all qualities that are in a powerful explanation, and I think to preempt anything, I would say this is what evolution has over intelligent design, like miles over intelligent design.
It doesn't seem to me, and maybe I'm wrong, but it doesn't seem to me that what Brandon is offering means that evolution can't also hold.
I
Like,
don't think so
this to
either.
me is an abiogenesis kind of question, like how did life come to the earth at the beginning? How was it seeded? And after that, evolution is fine. Am I right?
Yeah,
Is it that narrow?
you're absolutely correct. To be sure, there are plenty of intelligent design proponents who argue about evolution and universal common descent. And Stephen Meyer does look at the topic of evolution, and he finds evidence for an intelligent cause there. And those are really interesting arguments, but they're not necessary arguments to intelligent design. Intelligent design only requires that we observe some effects of mind somewhere. So, yeah, you can. It's completely possible to construct an inference to intelligent cause while also accepting all of evolutionary theory. And that's something we discussed at least briefly last time.
Right, like I'm thinking of, I hate to bring her up again when she's not here, but I'm thinking of Fiona. It seems to me she might
Yeah.
agree with you, right? She and she wouldn't have any problems with that. So she's a molecular biologist. She's believes in evolution. She also believes in God and Jesus and the resurrection and all of that. And so she might agree, given that we don't really know how suddenly the earth had life or gradually the earth had life. We only know that there was a point where there wasn't any life, and then there was a point where there was life, and she might leave open this possibility that you're postulating, that some kind of mind, and I guess for her it would be this disembodied mind, which would be a whole other argument, but still, that was the thing that started evolution. And the way you're describing intelligent design, somebody like that could agree with you and be fine.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, as far as Fiona, I've only gotten into that discussion once or twice, and we only talked very briefly about it. Um, but yeah, theistic evolutionists, they're very interesting to me, because it seems like um, you would expect that they have to be positing an intelligent cause, like some kind of a design argument, right? But sometimes what they'll say is that it's a personal belief or things like that. But but yeah, I understand what
Right.
you're
They'll
saying,
say
though.
it's not.
That
It's not. Yeah, my belief is not related to that. That
right,
we just don't know yet, or something.
yeah.
Something like that.
Which
Yeah.
I feel like there's a really open door there to say, well, I think your position is kind of a design position, though. You know,
Well,
but I
I think
haven't gotten that far.
another issue is I don't want to speak for Fiona, but I imagine other people who accept
Yeah, let's
evolution.
just imagine a hypothetical person who's
Yeah.
just not get off of Fiona's back.
Hypothiona.
Yeah.
I think Hypothiona she would think that you can't you can't understand God through science or empirical means. You have to step outside of that in order to understand God. Uh, I think this is kind of consistent with another theist who's on G Plus, who when I was when him and I were going back and forth on the fine tuning argument, and we were talking about why are humans valuable in the fine tuning argument, and he mentioned that's not something you're going to talk about in science. That's something you're going to have to step out of science and look at it from I don't know. He said from like theological
Yeah,
means and stuff. And
yeah,
I think that he's a very I guess for lack of a better term liberal Christian, in that I think he also does accept evolution and stuff, and that mindset is usually what's kind of used, is that you can't use these empirical means to understand something that they think is beyond the empirical. But it actually doesn't seem like that's your position. You think you can use like empirical means to understand at least the supernatural.
yeah. I definitely, I personally have a very hard time believing anything unless I have a positive reason to believe it. I went through this whole worldview shift when I was in my late teens and just coming out of high school, so that's really ingrained into my brain. I have to have positive reasons for believing something, and so it's just kind of I have no frame of reference for understanding why somebody would believe something if they have no rational support for that belief, or maybe they derive it from philosophy or something like that. But
Yeah, it could be
but
the case that they still have some rational support for it. They just think that it doesn't come from empiricism, from like looking at the natural world or something.
right, yeah, I guess that could be. But whether we're positing God or not, again, that's outside the purview of intelligent design. Although, yeah, I think if somebody's going to hold a belief about God and they're claiming that it's a rational belief, ultimately, I don't really see a distinction between that basic proposition and a design argument. You have to be making a design argument of some kind, I think, just to posit the mere existence.
Okay. Do you well, yeah, what do you think of, well, this might be going beyond intelligent design. Now we're going into theism arguments, I suppose. I guess to kind of slowly bring it back to less theism, though, an issue. I think I've brought this up in the past with you, but I don't know if we've ever like thrown down on it specifically. An issue that some people see with intelligent design, if it's not positing theism or or if it's not flat out going to a god, is that it actually becomes really, really vague. It actually doesn't become that powerful of a hypothesis, or it doesn't really contribute much because it's so concerned about not telling us more about the mind of the intelligent designer. Whereas if you do have it go to theism, if you do have it go to God, that actually kind of makes it, at least the hypothesis becomes less vague. If, for example, this is just an example, I'm not saying you're doing this, but if you go to the Christian God, we have a whole like set of books that tell us about what are the intentions of the Christian God, what are his views, what can be valued by such a God. Knowing that information about the intelligent designer seems like it actually would make for it would help us, it would make for a stronger hypothesis, one that could be tested a lot more.
Yeah, but I think then you're getting into philosophy and theology, though. So I don't think you're making it more scientific.
Not necessarily more scientific, just a better explanation. I'm fine with staying beyond this is science, this isn't science. I'm just looking at the best explanation, and I think that a better attempt at a.
I don't think.
Go ahead.
I'm sorry. I don't think you're saying best. You're arguing for that it's the best explanation. I think you're arguing.
Well, I don't think it's a best. I think it would have more qualities to it in order to test whether or not
it's more detailed or a more complete explanation, but not necessarily the best explanation.
No, I don't. I incidentally, I also think that falls apart. But with at least there, you're given more to work with as the intelligent design proponent. I almost see it as kind of a bummer that. Oh, go ahead.
More to work with is not necessarily a good thing, though. Intelligent design is constrained specifically to the question of whether we can posit an intelligent cause from the effects that we observe. And so the point that I always like to make when somebody says, well, you have to also know X, Y, and Z about the designer, that is really an unparsimonious objection, because you're requiring the explanation to be more complex than necessary to answer the question about whether we can infer an intelligent cause. You don't need to know, is this a Christian God? Is this some other God? Is it an alien? Is it some kind of programmer out there in some other universe that programmed us or whatever? Like, you don't have to know any of those things in order to posit from the effects of intelligent cause that an intelligent cause played a role. And so when you start requiring some of these other details, I see that as unparsimonious, an unparsimonious objection.
Well, it sounds like you're saying that, okay, this is the case if we want to explain X, like we have evidence X, and it would be good to explain that evidence X is designed. And to add too much would make for an unparsimonious explanation of X.
Yeah.
But the issue is, if a good explanation is one that has scope, one that's informative. So that, to me, implies that a good explanation would be able to explain a lot more. And if you do add those extra, attributes to the designer, I think that theoretically, that allow us to explain more? Because we know where it can allow us to guide our research. Like if we know that the intelligent designer only likes she only likes blue things, we could certainly narrow our enterprise to looking at things we're not sure how they arose, but they're blue, right? And if that's the case, you could, and it turns out that all things that are blue are actually designed, that seems to make intelligent design a lot more profound explanation, right? So if you do know things about go ahead.
I mean, I guess it's a pretty interesting point. I don't know that it contradicts anything so far that we've said, but
no, it shows that, like, I mean, there's explanations that intelligent design is competing with. Like, you could say, well, these molecular machines, they're designed, but that's it. That's all we could say. But if you use like a competing explanation, like from evolution, it's also better to. It also allows us to find out more information. Like if we go, well, look at this machine arose due to evolution. What about similar machines? What about similar things? And we can go and we can look at those similar things, and we can test and see if they fit the parameters of evolution. And if they do, that means we can study so much more. Whereas if it's just intelligent design, we can only say that it's designed in about this one thing. We can't go further.
I don't agree that you can't go further. You can posit other things from the design inference. So, for example, there's a great debate raging right now between Behe and Kenneth Miller about the flagellar motor. And from Behe's design perspective, he's proposed that the flagellar motor is ancestral, and that the Type 3 secretory system is a degradation of that design. Kenneth Miller posits the opposite conclusion. He says that the Type 3 secretory system is ancestral, and the flagellar motor evolved from the secretory system. So that's a testable hypothesis. It's not as though you just say, oh, this was designed, and you stop right there. You can explore other questions like, okay, if this was designed, what other expectations would we have about this system? The same kind of things are raised with respect to digital information in DNA. There's a paper. I'll have to just refer everybody to the bibliography at the Discovery Institute. The much maligned bibliography, although it does list peer-reviewed papers.
Focus on the Behe thing, Behe versus Miller. It sounds like the differences in their explanations is replacing deteriorated from Behe's explanation with evolved from Miller's explanation.
Yeah, that is a distinction. Mm-hmm.
Can you? I mean, it sounds like it was designed, but it deteriorated. Was the deterioration a part of the design? Whereas, I mean, saying evolved, sure, you have to unpack what he means by evolved, but it's a concept that has applications everywhere else, so we can already kind of infer what's meant by evolved. But what does it mean that it deteriorated? A good design. Well, not good. Go ahead.
Right. I mean, it's simply a matter of fact that things are more likely to deteriorate than to go the other way. It's the old top-down view versus a bottom-up view, and design takes a top-down view that things are designed initially, and maybe they decay afterwards. That's perfectly within the scope of intelligent design, that things can decay. But what the materialist view, but that's the problem, though. The materialist view is unconstrained in that respect.
What do you mean?
Like, intelligent design does not allow for material causes to produce these kinds of structures, to move from a bottom-up point of view. Whereas the evolutionary side, the first thing that it posits is that, yeah, it can move bottom-up. But, if it decays, that's okay, too. So the one point is that the materialist side is unconstrained, but the second point is that you have two competing hypotheses here, two competing specific propositions derived from competing worldviews. So it's not as though you just say, oh, it was designed and that's it. There are derivative claims that you can make from the design point of view that compete directly with the materialist point of view.
Yeah, but go ahead, Helena. Actually.
Well, I was just going to say, maybe you can explain how they compete, because from my understanding of what you're saying, that intelligent design is all about, I don't see how they compete even a little bit.
Well, in the example I gave, they're proposing opposite things. In the case of design, it's proposing that this structure was essentially front-loaded into life. Yeah, and then from there maybe it decayed and whatnot. The alternative proposition is that no, there was nothing there, and it evolved over time in an upward fashion, in a bottom-up fashion. as opposed to the top-down fashion on the design side. So I think they're directly competing hypotheses.
Well, but an intelligent design proponent could say of the second one that, it was just the beginnings that were, I guess, planted by the designer, and from there they evolved up.
Yeah, I
Well,
don't
if
think
you're
Brandon is saying like that the ideas are completely opposed. That like an intelligent design completely removes like evolution. He's just saying there are some parts of the current paradigm of evolutionary theory which are directly opposed to ID. So some parts of it are in opposition, but not the entire theory.
So what parts would be in opposition? Because it looks to me like intelligent design is talking about the abiogenesis problem and has nothing to say about evolution.
Well, there are arguments that are made for intelligent design from evolution. I don't really focus on those too much. So I kind of think that you are somewhat right that it pertains more to origins. But on those specific features, I think there's a clear difference. The design hypothesis proposes a top-down model versus the materialist bottom-up model.
Okay, so we have one extra thing that I was not aware of, which is that in order to be an intelligent design proponent, you must also adhere to a top-down model. And so maybe that's why you want to bring in these specifics, because now we've got to decide, what created thing was the top, right? And so maybe that's why these specifics that you that you seem to be suggesting are entailed, that may be why you find them to be entailed. So maybe this would be a good time to move on to DNA and how the way you see DNA implies for you that there must have been some intelligence involved, as opposed to it just sort of happening by accident or just following basic rules of physics and chemistry.
Yeah, now this has been the subject of a hot dispute around G+ lately, and kind of just in general. It's whether DNA actually contains code. So we know that code comes from an intelligent cause. We've been able to produce code, and code is kind of hard to define. Although I think it is well defined, it's kind of difficult to articulate it, but I'll give it a shot here. When we say that when we say we're looking at code, what we say that we are seeing is a sequence of what's called signal components. And this sequence of signal components are translated into disparate physical states. So the important point here is that the signal components, or the sequence, cannot be derived from the product of the translation without knowledge of the translation in the middle. So there's no direct affinity between the code and its output without the intermediary translation apparatus.
But the intermediary translation apparatus has to then have mind. It sounds to me like the way you're talking about it, because you've got to have a code, somebody who codes, an agent who codes, and an agent who decodes. And I don't see any agency anywhere in those molecules.
Well, I'm not saying that there has to be agency. We're trying to identify whether or not it is a code. And DNA has a sequence of the base pairs, and those sequences are transcribed and then they're translated in the ribosome into amino acids.
Right, but are you saying that the ribosome is consciously doing translation work?
No, just because there's code doesn't mean that mind is necessary to translate that code.
I think I might disagree with that. It seems to me that you can't, designers don't design code for non-agents.
I think what you're saying is that it's like it's a computer. A designer will design the process, but then let it run,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, we wouldn't say that the computer is conscious just because it translates zeros and ones into text on your screen.
But the computer's not doing any actual translating in the way that it seems like, at least on first blush, you mean to apply. I mean, if you're saying it's kind of like a computer, then then where's the mind?
Well, I mean, it sounds like you're kind of making a design inference.
So tell me how I've done that.
Well, you're kind of saying that a coding system requires a mind. Almost sounds like.
Well, I think I'm saying that it sounds like that's what you're saying.
Okay. Well, I don't think the process of translation does not require a mind. It only requires that signal components are assigned to particular outputs. So like in your computer, you've got the ASCII code. That translates sets of zeros and ones into English characters. So that's the translation there, the translation apparatus. So that you see the same thing in DNA. You've got the code, or you've got the sequence of base pairs, which we call the code, and that is translated by an intermediary apparatus, the ribosome, into the amino acids. You can't derive the code from the amino acids without knowledge about the way that they're translated, without knowledge about the translation system, because there's no direct affinity. You have to have the translation system in there. And so that's how we ascertain that this is indeed a code.
How do we ascertain that it is indeed a code? Just repeat that.
Yeah, I know it's a tough concept.
Well, I just don't see. Yeah, it's hard for me to find the designer in DNA and how DNA works.
It sounds like it's better. It sounds like it's more, we can explain it in terms of it being a code, not necessarily that the process itself is actually just like there's nothing actually writing out a code and then deciphering it. That's not what's actually happening when you have a messenger RNA taking. I mean, messenger RNA isn't a guy in a three-corner hat on a horse taking a message to some other part of the cell. But a good analogy for the process that's happening is that there's messenger RNA, and another good analogy is that there's a code, and this code needs to be written. But I think. What's up?
Well, there are kind of two things that I have in mind here. The first is that there seems to be this assumption that in order for there to be code, a mind has to be interpreting that code, and I just don't think that that's true. I think that
I can see how that's not true. But I can totally see how that's not true. You can use the computer analogy, but so the mind's not there, right? I mean, the postulated required mind doesn't have to be there.
Yeah.
So we can eliminate that one. But it's in the code part. And so maybe, I mean, if you agree with me that it's in the code part, you could explain how it is that you see it that way when you're looking at what's going on with DNA.
Well, I think what he's saying, like I can simplify it right down, is that if you look at the physical system, there doesn't seem to be any constraint in the system, any force or any kind of potential which is constrained ordering. Therefore, it would seem to have to be something outside of that system which is constraining the ordering.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it, and that's very similar to how Michael, I'm not sure I'm going to say the last name right, but it's Polanyi, I think. I'll try to spell it in the side chat. But yeah, he made that same argument that the code itself is not derivable from the laws of physics or chemistry that we know of. So you have to posit something external to to the system to explain the code. And that's an argument that goes back to I think the 60s, but never really got much attention until relatively recently. But so I guess I just want to emphasize that it's not just an analogy. Okay, people say that it's an analogy all the time. That's one of the common objections here. It's just an analogy, but I think it actually fits exactly the definition for code. You know, where you've got the signals and they're translated into disparate physical states where there's no direct affinity between the product of translation and the code being translated. So, when I hear people say that it's just an analogy, like, here's an analogy: train of thought. That's an analogy. Like, your thoughts and both thoughts and trains, they move in one linear direction. That's the similarity there. But they're dissimilar in every other way. Obviously, thoughts are not, they don't exist in the physical world, and trains are not just mental abstractions, so they're completely dissimilar in every other way. And it seems like the definition of analogy that people are working with when they say that DNA as code is just an analogy is it fits every part of the description. And that's what an analogy. That's not an analogy. That means it fits the description. It is the thing. That's not analogous. And I think DNA fits the description of code. And this is not a mere analogy where the two things are similar in maybe one important respect and dissimilar in every other respect. It fits all of the qualities of actually being the code, I think.
Not necessarily saying that I'm not even saying that analogies are bad things. What I'm saying is that because of the analogy, it seems like it's a lot easier to suppose that it's a code written by a person, by a mind. And I think that there's kind of an issue that arises from using those kinds of analogies. I think the way you would Polanyi, it sounds like Michael Polanyi is the person who you said was related to this discussion, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. His name looks like it's like polydactyl, like it should be that kind of name. Yeah, I mean, I have no problems with using these analogies, but I think that in this case, the analogy is confusing the issue of using code, for example. Maybe not code, but other analogies like machines, I think, are even worse. I think that Massimo Pigliucci and I think it's Martin Boundary have some good articles about switching from the use of machines and maybe even things like language to other types of analogies so that these kinds of issues don't arise. What is it? Yeah, so I guess I don't necessarily have a problem with the code analogy. My issue is that I don't have a problem with using analogies in science, but my issue with the code analogy is that it allows us to get into this thinking that, oh, it's a code written by someone, and not the confusion that you said earlier, that there's minds in every single aspect of this, but the idea that someone wrote a code and kind of let it go, and then I guess in terms of the flagellum, in terms of the Behe example, someone wrote a code for the motor on an organism with a flagellum, and it deteriorated into what we see today. I guess that's what my next question would be: is it the case that all these explanations from intelligent design proponents that you would look for deteriorated? How could you decide what is code and what is just a deteriorated remnant of that code? How can you and how can you differentiate that from evolutionary processes, especially if intelligent design proponents like yourself are fine with evolutionary explanations.
Well, that's a pretty interesting question about how you would perform the experiments. But I mean, you're kind of. Oh, I'm getting an echo, Joe.
Oh, sorry.
But I mean, simply in asking that question, it's almost a concession that, yeah, intelligent design does posit testable propositions. It's just a question of how do you test them. And with the flagellar motor, I have to brush up on my knowledge about the current state of research, but I believe there's at least one case where you can, where the code that's coding for the Type 3 secretory system, it has the code for the flagellar motor. It's just, and we can identify the degradation, the mutation or whatever it was, where it caused the full motor not to be expressed. So I think that's a case where you can say that it looks like the flagellar motor was indeed ancestral here. So it's in the first place, we're kind of making the point that yeah, intelligent design does posit testable propositions, and there's an example of how you might be able to test it. You could see if the full code of the flagellar motor exists in the code for the secretory system, but maybe there's some kind of mutation that prevents the full motor from being expressed. That's a very specific example.
Well, my issue with that is you said that the one instance of this motor versus the later instance of this motor was the result of degradation, and then you said degradation or mutation. I mean, why is it? I mean, you're kind of putting some sort of value judgment on what mutation is by saying, well, not value judgment. Let me step back a bit. Yeah, I don't see why calling it degradation. It seems to me that an intelligent design proponent would just say that this is degradation. But if you're a proponent of evolution, you would say this is mutation. And in saying it's mutation, you can eventually explain so much more. But if you say it's degradation and you say that it is the case that here's an example of what something degradating, what something like I guess deteriorating into a new thing is, then I don't see why I don't see how that is a better explanation than if we do just stick with the original explanation, which is this is a mutation. It seems like just saying it's a mutation will allow us to find out so much more, and it also is something that saying that it's a mutation actually fits with our background knowledge. Mutations do propagate the new organisms that might look like it's deteriorated, but if anything, it's the mutation was selected for in order to respond to its environment. That's
well, you're
with evolution, and to say that it's degraded, I don't. But it's through design. It doesn't seem like it doesn't seem that helpful. And also, I think really quick, yeah, I'm fine with saying that intelligent design can generate testable hypotheses. I think that what we're doing right now is we're testing. This whole entire night we've been testing intelligent design, right? I just think that once you look into it, it doesn't pass the test. That's all.
Okay, so I'm just going to make an abrupt change here because I'm getting sleepy and I've invited some people. So, Brandon, I hope you'll come back for part 3 because we didn't even get into it. Should it be a science or should it be a philosophy? Should we put it in schools? Shouldn't we? What would that look like or anything like that? So I want to just thank you, Brandon and Cliff. You guys can stick around if you want. I'm going to open up the Hangout, and we will sort of go wild at this point, and hopefully we can meet again soon for part 3.
You presented him. You got to show. There you go.
Okay.
Sup?
So we have artist141M ... Nice to meet you.
Hello.
I think we may have been in the same hangout once.
Yeah, I
A few times.
Or maybe a few times. So is nice to meet you, and well, I'm assuming you've listened to at least a piece of it. So shoot.
I only just caught on the very tail end there, like 20 seconds or so. And from what you said in Xbox's chat, because I was in there first, come in and help me argue against DNA is a code. So what's the claim?
Comma, if you want. Close comma, paren. If you want, close paren, right? I mean, come on, be fair.
Oh, I'm gonna be there.
Okay.
So yeah, what was the claim?
Well, the claim is that DNA contains code. There's
Do you mean the analogy or?
Well, what I pointed out earlier was that when people claim that it's analogy, the definition of analogy seems to be it meets the definition in every respect. Whereas an analogy should be something where it should be a comparison between two things that are similar in one important respect, but are dissimilar in really every other respect. That's an analogy.
So
Analogy
this is a particular
not,
argument I haven't heard before. So the question would be, if we go by this, then can we find things where they are disanalogous or where they aren't the same? You are suggesting that in fact they are the same in every respect, and so to claim it's an analogy is, well, cheating.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that's not to say that DNA is exactly the same as like a computer code, for example, because they're obviously very different, but they're not different in important ways that disqualify DNA from being an actual code.
Welcome, Jade.
Yeah, it is. It is like if you look at the definition of code, it's symbols, words, letters, and figures, and so forth, to give purpose. DNA isn't a code by any means. It's chemical structure, and those chemical interactions start to produce things, proteins. It's not
Amino acids.
a code at all. We've allocated letters to them to shorten for their names. Guanine, for example. It's not a code in that sense.
Well, nobody says that it's code because we assign letters to it. We say it's code because it's translated into physical states that are discontinuous from the code itself. You cannot derive the code from the product of translation without knowledge about the translation system.
Well, because of base pairing, we do know that if I'm getting a specific sequence of in a protein, I know what that's coming from. Do you know what a codon is?
A codon, yeah, it's the base pair triplets. But you only know the outcome there because you have knowledge about the translation system.
Hi, can I do a test? Can you guys hear me okay?
We hear you.
Yep.
Okay, and who cares if I know how it works? What matters is that it works inside the cell.
Yeah. So we've allocated, letters and given them names, and you have a specific, base pairing rule. But that's about it. And so I don't know how that points to anything intelligent or otherwise. It's just that is how it works. So why can't it, I don't.
Well, I don't think that
Where's the end
answer
goal?
to
Where's the end goal? Where's the end goal?
Well, the end goal is determined by the translation system.
No, but the end goal of your argument here.
Oh, well, let's not bother with
The end goal is that this is this effect is a known product of an intelligent cause. So here we're trying to establish if indeed it does fit the description of an effect that separately we know is caused by mind. So we're establishing that it does fit the description of effects that are known to be produced by mind.
So we know that sexual reproduction isn't produced by mind. Does that mean it's intelligent?
Nobody's saying that that DNA itself is intelligent, or at least I'm not, and no design proponents that I'm aware of make that
No, but I mean,
claim.
like, it's if I'm fucking a woman and I spread my seed, it's going to make her fall pregnant if things line up right. But that's not the product of intelligence. This is chemistry. What's happening? I'm not sure how you're going to
Well,
illuminate.
nobody.
Yeah, I don't
Yep,
want to get
there's.
too far, we started the hangout and we've kind of gotten to this point, and I don't want to have to go backwards unless we don't have anything else to do, right? So if we could, just sort of stay where we are, because I'm really interested in this idea that DNA is an actual code, and so and we've got Jade here, and maybe even a couple of other people who have more knowledge in biology and can talk about this particular issue. And then the next thing I'd like to do is, let's suppose it is a code. Does that really mean therefore mind, or could an actual code happen naturally? So, Jade, what do you think of this idea that every sort of attribute we give to code, when we think about computer codes and things like that, also fit here for DNA? And does that mean, does that imply what Brandon is suggesting it implies?
Well, as someone who's done computer programming and even studied computer structure on the hardware level, going down to the electrical circuit theory level, we see patterns everywhere, and it's easy to call a pattern a code. I can see an argument for calling DNA a code, and I can see an argument for not calling it a code. It depends on what you mean by code. I don't consider it a code, but that's again, my opinion, my definition of the word, of code, because it's just simply a chemical that, when matched with another chemical, creates a chemical reaction, and that's the way I look at it. I don't. Yes, it will create something, but so do a lot of other, chemical and physical and physiological processes create other things. The neurons in our brain create patterns. Are we going to call those codes too? So to me, it's not a code. I would have to have someone give me a much better argument than I've heard for it being a code. But even if it were even if you want to call it a code, which again I have a little difficulty with, it just doesn't seem to fit for me. So what? If you're going to call it a code, yes, it does. You have a chemical that creates another chemical that creates another chemical, and they do these by pure chemical processes, which are governed by the laws of physics and chemistry. So, of course, I suppose I could argue that a computer code creates things on the basic level governed by the electrical circuit theory. That's a bit of a stretch for me. So I just don't see it as a code. And I haven't really heard, to me, what is a good argument for it being a code, or why it matters if it is a code.
Just interject something at this point in time. It's one of the most pointless discussions that we can have on G+, is whether or not something fits or doesn't fit a particular label. And I mean, G-Man is famous for it all the time. Whether or not somebody is or isn't a Christian, who cares? So we could debate over what it means to say something is a code and whether or not DNA fits that meaning or not. The argument from ID is that DNA has some set of properties, and the set of properties that it has entails that a mind was involved in it. Now, whether you want to say that those set of properties make it a code or not is a semantical issue. But the set of properties that entail a mind, I think, is the interesting point of the conversation.
And where does the mind come in, too, which would be another interesting point to me.
Yeah, I don't know if you heard earlier when we were discussing some of this, but the translation system is crucial here. The fact is that the code by itself has no inherent meaning from which you can derive the product of translation. Like, for example, H2O, those atoms do not in code for water, they actually are water. There's an affinity there between the starting constituent parts and the end result there. But with a code, there's no affinity between the initial signal components and the product of their translation. You can't derive one from the other without knowledge about the translation system in the middle.
No, you don't need knowledge to derive one. Well, we personally, if a human is going to derive one from another, we need that information. But the cells do it all on their own through chemical processes.
Yeah, via a translation system. They utilize the ribosome.
It's a chemical process. It's chemistry. Yeah. It's the same as...
yeah, nobody's arguing that it's not chemistry. I mean, translation and code, I think they have to exist on some kind of a substrate. I mean, that's pretty obvious to me. Nobody's saying that it's not, that chemistry doesn't operate here. But what we are saying is that you can identify the certain properties which we would attribute to an intelligent cause. The properties of a system that we would attribute to an intelligent cause. The translation system there, where a signal is translated into a disparate physical state.
But I'm not seeing how this needs to necessitate a... Eventually this is going to go down to the path of a biogenesis, but I don't see the point of, like Cliff said, what's the point in trying to...
The point is attributing effects to their known causes. And the known cause for these kinds of translation systems is intelligent mind.
Yeah.
So we don't know that chemistry alone can produce them.
So if base pairing is just going to be chemistry, then why can't it be the only thing?
Sorry, can you say that again?
But base pairing isn't intelligent, it's just chemistry. And like you said, it's just chemistry. So if we know things and how they work is chemistry, then why can't it just be chemistry?
It's not just chemistry. It's a translation system that operates on chemistry. But the question that you're not answering though is whether chemistry alone and the physical laws can produce these kinds of translation systems.
Yes, it can. Yes.
Where's your information on that? I'd be very interested.
So
because the latest information I'm aware of is the scientists who tackled the sequencing problem, and they were unable to derive a coding and translation system without appeal to a prior code. So that's the latest information. That's from last year. So what information do you have that's newer than that says that, yeah, nature can actually produce these things. Chemistry can actually produce these systems, because I haven't...
Well, if we look at the cell and everything that's going on with translation, transcription, and so forth, it is just chemistry. We don't see any magic word going on there. So I can just go, okay, well, it's just chemistry. I don't see God or anything supernatural toying in there. If you've ever played with genetics, that would be inherent. Or if you've ever read a textbook, it would be inherent.
Yeah, but again, you're not answering the question, though, simply by saying it's just chemistry.
I could
say, yeah, it's just chemistry. I could say, yeah, sure, it's just chemistry. However you want to describe it is fine. But it still has... The system as a whole still has these properties
that are just chemical,
of systems that we know are designed, and we don't know that nature can produce these kinds of systems.
Well, we've got going down to deconstructivism, where you look at the evolution of like ATP synthase. That's a favorite for everyone on G+. You can see precursors to ATP. It's not ATP synthase. It's not that trivial anymore. So you can look at specific molecules and how they interact, and you go to other species and you can find other versions of it that are quote unquote less complex. And then you can, in the laboratory, you can take, if you have a full version of an ATP synthase, you can take away parts of it, and then the thing still works and does what it does. So you can go, okay, well, there's a less complex version that still does the same shit. And less complex organisms, as it were. So you can see an evolution of these things. And then eventually you're going to get to the point of a biogenesis, which we know is definitely pretty established as a hypothesis.
I don't think so.
It's a hypothesis. It's an established hypothesis.
Okay, yeah, sure, it's a hypothesis. Nobody disagrees that it's a hypothesis.
Good.
But I think you've made a jump, though. you went from discussing the code and
Well, that's
can nature
going down the
explain
rabbit
these
hole to
can
the
nature
point of the
explain these
argument.
kinds of systems to
Yeah,
talking
because
about the
Hey,
evolution of
MMA, hold
other
on.
kinds of structures.
Let Brandon go ahead. Brandon, what was
Yeah,
the
thanks.
jump? I couldn't hear you.
Yeah, the jump was we went from talking about the origin of the coding system and the translation system to can these other kinds of structures evolve, like irreducibly complex structures or other kinds of structures. That's a completely different topic there. So you made a leap from talking about code to talking about something else. So you still haven't answered the question about
you've
code.
you've been asking about how it all happened, right? So you're going to go down to abiogenesis and what we have on that so far. That's what the ultimate crux of this is going to go towards. You're trying to assert that, God did it, intelligence did it. And then I'm going to have to go down to abiogenesis, to
That's
the
not
origins of
that's not
RNA
what
and so
he's.
forth.
Yeah, actually, at the beginning of the hang-in, I know you hadn't heard it. We kind of talked about this, and really, Brandon is really insisting that intelligent design at its core has been misunderstood, and it's not about God or the supernatural or anything. And to me, at least, it seems as though it really is about abiogenesis, and even to the point that trying to speculate about what is the nature of this designer is outside of the purview of the theory.
I'm a bit lost on that.
Basically, Brandon doesn't use intelligent design to infer that God exists, nor does he think that positing God helps intelligent design theory in any way. He
But
wants
he
to
still
keep
thinks
it
it's
within
intelligent design.
science. I'm sorry?
He's still going to deposit intelligent design, though.
Well, yeah, but he doesn't do it based off of leading to God.
Yeah,
We
he's not.
actually
He's not trying to. He's not going to try and
No, he's
point to
not.
God.
In fact, all he's positing is that something is designed. He's not even positing concepts about
Yeah.
God's intentions. I mean, a
Yeah.
criticism of his position is that it would be better if he could posit the intentions of God, but he doesn't think so, and he's elaborated on that earlier. So, to continue, I think Brandon actually hasn't talked anything about abiogenesis. I'm not sure. Maybe we should find out, Brandon, what is your view on abiogenesis, and if you think you can actually talk about it.
Well, I mean, abiogenesis, I think everybody agrees that that's a hypothesis, and we don't really know how nature could have produced the first life. So I think it's very simple to say that there is not currently an alternative materialist explanation for the origin of the coding and translation system that all known life runs off of. I think it's
Nothing is established. Yeah.
Yeah, nothing is established so far. So the important point about that is that there is not currently an alternative to design.
No, we have the alternative to design. It hasn't reached theory status yet.
Not a causally adequate one.
When I say it's well supported, there is a lot of research pointing towards abiogenesis. So you can't discount it because it's a hypothesis, but nor can you assert it as an inherent fact. But if things keep going the way they're going, in about 2 or 3 years, it's going to be a theory. So
I've been hearing
we're
that for
going
about
to
20
use that. No.
Well, even not even looking at abiogenesis, not even looking at going from non-life to life, we already have some very good clues about how DNA was composed. We know how to create, or how at least 4 of the base pairs were likely created. We understand some of the chemical reactions that could go into creating DNA, and you even create, not DNA, excuse me, RNA. But even creating RNA, even if RNA comes about as a natural process, that doesn't necessarily mean there's life.
Right.
So it doesn't even have to be abiogenesis. But as far as what you're talking about here is you're saying, well, we've got this code, which, okay, I'll accept that term for the sake of argument, and we've got this code, and this code creates something. But we have lots of chemical processes that create complicated things, from photosynthesis to the Krebs cycle to lots of physiological processes in our body, and even chemical processes, in in nature, in the universe. So why is this one different, or is it different, or are you going to posit an intelligent origin for things like photosynthesis and the Krebs cycle?
Well, you have to determine whether or not something is evidence for an intelligent cause by whether or not intelligent cause is known to produce the same effects. So you have to have some pretty well-defined effects in order to determine that. Code is one of those effects, or code in the translation system, I think, is one of those effects. And then another is irreducible complexity. And I don't know enough about the systems that you
Okay.
raised
Well,
to know if they're irreducibly complex. But that's the question. Do they exhibit qualities and properties of effects that we know to be the product of mind? And secondly, is there a material alternative explanation, a material cause?
So to me, it's like you're saying for those things that we have an explanation for, we don't need intelligent design, but the things we don't have an explanation for, we need intelligent design. Because both photosynthesis and the Krebs cycle both create energy. And that's kind of a really important thing. Photosynthesis is the basis of, all life in a sense, because it creates the food that we all need to survive. The Krebs cycle is used in our bodies to create the energy we need to survive. So these are, complex chemical systems. And there are lots and lots of others. So it doesn't make sense to me.
It's not an argument from complexity.
But it's not you're saying something is, irreducibly complex, but for it to be irreducibly complex, we don't have an answer for it yet. That's what it sounds like to me.
Right, and let me clarify. It's not an argument that's unconstrained. You can't just say it's an intelligent cause just because we don't know of an alternative cause. Just because we don't know the material cause doesn't justify the inference to design. Design is constrained only to the effects known to be the product of a mind. So that's what you have to establish in order to infer an intelligent cause. You can't just say, oh, we don't know how nature done it, therefore an intelligent cause. That's not the argument. The argument is constrained to the effects known to be the product of a mind.
Wait a minute, what are you comparing design to?
Well, we have experience with the activity of minds. We have direct, repeated experience with minds.
I mean, but what are you contrasting design to? Are you contrasting it to more design, or are you contrasting it to what's naturally occurring?
Naturally occurring, so material cause. Like, we ask the question, is there an alternative to the design hypothesis from material causes?
How far does your design go?
Well, it's constrained to the known effects of mind. So that's how far it goes. It only goes that far.
No, well, how are you accounting for naturally occurring things, then?
Accounting for them? Well, we ask the question, is there an alternative material explanation for these effects?
Okay.
So how do you say, what you're doing is you're saying we're looking at things that could be created by a mind, correct?
Well, we're saying that we're looking at effects that are the known products of a mind, wherever we know the cause.
So how does this work with DNA and RNA? How do we know that? How are these known products of a mind? How are these processes known products of a mind? I don't see that.
Right. Well, we don't know. Intelligent design doesn't make an absolute claim saying that we know it was a mind. It only says that there are cases where we do know from direct observation that mind produces these effects. Therefore, wherever we observe these effects, mind is simply a explanatory resource that's available to us. And
may I jump in here?
Okay, go ahead.
I'm just curious. I'll forego the idea of using of the word mind and having difficulty with the language,
Sure.
the idea of separating mind from brain. I'll forego all of that for a moment. But
Sure.
it seems to me that you're suggesting that the products of a mind are order and complex order even. And we have plenty of evidence that order and even complex order occurs naturally without intervention of an external agency or mind. Why does this particular event require a mind in order for the order and complexity to come about, when we have evidence of many different processes which, even without life being involved, create order through chaotic means?
Yeah, that's a good question.
I mean,
Because
statistically,
it's
if
not
you
mere
have enough
complexity.
instances of chaos, some order will come about. That's a
Yeah,
statistical
sure.
concept.
Yeah, and it's a good question, and I like it because you're not characterizing the argument as an argument from complexity. You're also recognizing that order is part of the inference here.
Yes,
And
absolutely.
we definitely we agree that nature produces order. And in fact, we would also agree that the second law of thermodynamics does not disagree that nature can produce order, because we observe that when things change or transition between energy states, spontaneous order does emerge. Like when you drain your water from the sink, it spirals down the sink. So as it's transitioning from one energy state to another energy state, you can see spontaneous order emerging with your very own eyes, right?
Thank you.
Right. So I agree that definitely we observe order emerge spontaneously, but it's a question of what kind of order. And so you have to ask. Sure, nature produces
Well, I
order.
mean,
Sure, nature produces order, but does it produce this specific, well-defined kind of order? So I don't
well,
think that it's generalizable. It's generalizable to the specific evidences.
statistically, if you have a large enough field of opportunities, then some data point would intersect with that much order and complexity somewhere in the model of chaos. It would randomly occur. And so if we have enough space-time for such to occur, then it would seem natural and expected, rather than something miraculously created. It would be
Yeah.
apparent by the statistical spread that eventually this particular outcome would necessarily occur. At which point
Yeah.
you
So
get back to creative origin of universe that would eventually come to here. And I'm not even going there yet, but with just this abiogenesis question, I don't see a need to engage any kind of intelligence just because order and even complex order came about.
Okay, so let's give
Right, but
Brandon an opportunity to respond.
yeah, and you raised another really interesting argument, that given enough probabilistic resources, essentially anything is possible. It's practically ensured by the spread of the statistical outcomes.
Including the intelligent designer concept, yes.
Right. Okay. So this assumes, though, a random system. And what I would point out is that nature is non-random. Nature is biased. So what you have to posit is not that in a random system all of these outcomes are inevitable given enough probabilistic resources. What you have to establish is actually that nature possesses the right biases that do not preclude the construction of these systems or the production of these specific effects. You have to establish that nature is biased in the right way to produce these specific effects, or these specific, well-defined instances of order.
Why? Why does nature have to be biased in favor of if it's a probabilistic outlier?
Well, what I'm saying is that it's not purely probabilistic because nature is biased. So it's a completely open question now.
Well, nature, yeah,
It's
nature
a completely
is the
open
system.
question as to
It's
whether it's
without-
biased in a way that precludes these structures from occurring naturally, or whether it facilitates the production of them.
And my suggestion is that it is biased in favor of at least one probable outcome becoming us. And because it has that bias in terms of the largesse of spread, that it is inescapable that we should come about, and here we are as the example proof that yes, it does happen.
Yeah, but you've just helped yourself to the material explanation. You said, we exist, therefore we know nature can do it. It's just a question of how. We don't accept
Right,
those premises.
suggesting that we don't, I heard you earlier suggesting we don't know the mechanism by which this came about, and you're correct. We don't actually have any eyes on the ground at that point of space-time. However, we do have enough inferences to make rational conclusions that do have more probability than an external agency being engaged.
Yeah, but I don't really agree.
The external agency doesn't appear in the rest of the physics, chemistry and biology that derive from the physics. So there's no need, there's no need for the external agency.
Well, the need is determined by causal adequacy.
I'm not accepting. I'm not just like running out and embracing the materialistic conclusion. I'm finding the material conclusion to be the most rational and probable.
Right, and the way that we sift through these competing hypotheses is which explanation is known to be causally adequate to produce the effect in question. For these specific effects, mind.
But we also look for predictive value, and there's no predictive value in an external agency creating life on Earth, so we're not looking for that. I agree that we're not looking for that.
Right, I would disagree about the predictive value, but simply the point that we have a cause that is known to be adequate to produce the effect. I mean, that's the point there. And then it's a question of whether there's a material cause that is an alternative and causally adequate to produce.
Are you necessarily positing at this juncture that this was a supernatural, or could this have been a natural cause, for example, some other form of intelligent life, as we know it, that isn't supernatural but rather natural? That
I think he said many times, of course it could be natural.
Okay, so it could be aliens, as we call them colloquially.
Yes.
Yeah, and it's also a semantic question, too.
Yeah.
We tackled this from a number of different angles.
We did. We did talk about
in the future, I tend to believe that there will be intelligent design and that we will be the designers. I don't have evidence of anything else yet, although if we do succeed in such a paradigm, that would be evidence that perhaps we were in the same way, seeded somehow. So I'm not going to even posit that we weren't seeded. I'm just suggesting that we don't yet have any evidence of that either.
Okay, so
the evidence is the effect for which we have no cause.
Okay, I want to. I'm getting sleepy, to be honest. So I want to give some of the people who just came a chance to talk, and then I've just got to close it out. I'll leave it offline, but I'm going to have to turn the live part off. So, any of the newcomers want to say anything?
I'd just like to close with, I heard a gunshot and a man died, but that doesn't mean that the gunshot led to the man dying. So the consequence to me, or the effect to me, doesn't necessarily give me evidence of the cause. Thank you. Aloha.
Thanks for the thoughts.
And I'd just like to say that although we haven't been able to design life per se yet, we do have intelligent design of a lot of complex systems. We're already creating complex systems. We also have unintelligent design of some complex systems because computers are doing it. And you could try to argue and say, yes, but we designed the computers. However, the immediate cause of such designs are unintelligent. And I don't see, if you say, well, we know that certain things come from a mind, Well, we also know that certain things come from just simple natural processes. So I'm, certainly willing to listen to arguments, but I see nothing that convinces me that intelligent design is anything more than a mere hypothesis at the moment.
Right, but I think it's a viable one. The question is whether there's an alternative to mind for the specific effects that we've discussed.
Yeah, nature.
Right. So that's
what I would take.
the open question there, and
So
that's
kind of the crux of
compare
the
the hypotheses. Yeah.
Okay, so I'm gonna. I hope you will come back for a part 3. Thank you, everybody. I'm gonna keep it going, but I'm just gonna go off broadcast so that I can sleep a little. Thank you so
Helena.
much. I really appreciate this nice conversation, and so I'm just really happy that we're able to have it.